On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, a new vision for global security at the Munich Security Conference. China makes its case for multilateralism and major power relations.
Make the international order more just and equitable.
And cooperation on technology and education between China and the U.S. Our interview with President of Yale University, a renowned Ivy League school in the U.S. Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. We begin with news from Germany, where around 500 leaders and policymakers from around the world gathered for the annual Munich Security Conference. Relations across the Atlantic were put to the test again, and the push for multilateralism was picking up steam.
The gap across the Atlantic is getting wider. The three-day meetings were a testament to the difficulties of the U.S. and its European allies in finding common ground on some security areas.
We came here to reaffirm our commitment that America first does not mean America alone, to tell leaders, allies, partners, countries around the world that America is stronger than ever before and America is leading on the world stage once again.
German Chancellor Angela Merkel had to explain to the American Vice President that German cars made in the USA pose no threat to national security.
Look, we are proud of our cars. We are allowed to be. And these cars are built in the US, not in Bavaria, but in South Carolina. And if these cars are no less threatening if they are built in South Carolina than if they are built in Bavaria, suddenly are the threats to U.S. national security? That startles us.
The Iran nuclear deal remains a bone of contention.
We call on our European allies to stop undermining U.S. sanctions against Iran, to join with us in further isolating Iran economically and diplomatically, and to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal.
And again, Ms. Merkel tried to knock some sense into her American friends.
Do we help our common cause, our common aim of containing the damaging or difficult influences of Iran by withdrawing from the one remaining agreement, or do we help it more by keeping the small anchor we have in order to exert pressure in other areas?
And it turned out to be a lot easier for the German leader to find common ground with China. Her appeal for multilateralism were echoed by Yang Jieqi, the leader of the Chinese delegation.
China advocates a steadfast commitment to advance international cooperation, uphold and develop multilateralism, and make the international order more just and equitable.
Compared to Ms. Merkel, Mr. Yang knows more about being called threat to U.S. national security.
I hope some Americans will have a little bit more confidence in themselves and be a little bit more respectful to other people. People should not and cannot be misled. Huawei, as a company, is cooperating very closely with European countries, and Chinese law doesn't require companies to install backdoors or collect intelligence.
Other issues such as the cancellation of the INF Treaty, the U.S. troop withdrawal from Syria, NATO military spendings, and Germany's trade ties with Russia all remain unresolved during the conference.
So what are the biggest global security threats today, and how were the discussions at the Munich Security Conference? And we are joined by a very strong panel with me in Beijing. We have Rong Ying, the Vice President of CIIS, that's the China Institute of International Studies, with us. Welcome, sir. Also joining us in Beijing, Professor Wang Yiwei, the Jean Monnet Chair for Professor and Director of the Center for European Studies with Renmin University. Welcome as well. In Washington, D.C., we invited Douglas Paul, a distinguished fellow at the Asia program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Welcome as well, sir. in Brussels. Last but not least, Fraser Cameron, a senior advisor at the European Policy Center. It's good to see you again as well, Mr. Cameron. I want to start with you, Mr. Cameron. Help us to understand the nature of the latest stage of this cross-Atlantic exchange taking place at the Munich Security Conference.
Well, it's very bad. There's no way to hide the fact that there's very different views in terms of the future of the multilateral system between Europeans and Americans. But not all Americans. I think the biggest applause was actually for Joe Biden's speech when he basically contradicted almost everything that Mike Pence had said and held out the prospect for a new Democratic administration changing policy in a couple of years' time. And Nancy Pelosi was there. She was another one to get a big welcome from the Europeans at Munich. So there's a question of whether we hold on for 2 years and hope for a change, or if there's no change, then how do we actually deal with this fundamentally different world view that the United States has? Multilateralism really for the birds, unilateralism is what they want.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Paul, are our European colleagues skillful enough to deal with a divided America, whether it's at the Security Conference or not at the Security Conference?
Well, that's a tough question. I think we'll find out the answer by watching their behavior. Clearly, the last year and a half has not produced the results they were hoping for, and they're taking a more confrontational approach now, as exemplified at the Munich conference over the weekend. The U.S. likes multilateralism as long as it follows American unilateral desires under this administration. I think it was important that such a large congressional delegation came over to Munich in order to send an alternative signal to the Europeans so they don't give up hope. I just wish the Democratic candidates who are running for office would sound the same themes that the congressional delegation did. So far, they are not doing that.
Well, there are a long list of names there when you talk about the candidates for 2020 coming from the Democratic Party. We'll see how and whether it's going to be shortened later. But Professor Wang, from your perspective, you've been a researcher about transatlantic relations and China's relations with the European countries. Help us to understand, for example, some of the issues, the Iran issue. How is it now that the different approaches taken by the European countries as a whole, if we could use that word, and also America, the current administration, likely to help us understand the different perspectives or even system of thoughts of dealing with international relations?
I think there's three major differences between the United States and the European Union over the Iranian nuclear issues. First, the European Union highlights the principles of peaceful negotiation, multilateral talks. That's the European Union plus the Germany, France, and the UK. And the six, I think the pioneer role to make this deal is very difficult and very important. Secondly, I think the European Union also highlights the principle of the United Nations non-proliferation regime. So it's highly connected with North Korea and other nuclear issues. And thirdly, I think the United States, with the hegemonic power of the SWIFT system to sanctions with any European Union's companies to do business, normal business with Iran. So this makes the European Union want to have their own system, SPV, and bypass the SWIFT system to focus on the multipolar world.
That's a crucial issue, isn't it? Will that be the dividing factor, given the complicated implications Professor Wang just illustrated to Mr. Cameron for the current administration in the U.S. and most of the European countries for the near term, the Iran issue? Mr. Cameron, please.
I missed the question. Could you repeat it, please?
Yes. The question is the Iran issue apparently becoming this really dividing factor between U.S. and the European countries? I mean, the U.S., the current administration, of course, that's the one who's making the decision about national policies now in the White House. So will that be the one, or this is only like a storm in a teacup, likely to go off pretty easily for months to come?
No, it's one of the biggest issues because there's a very different view of why the Europeans want to uphold an international treaty which is really part of the UN system. So the Iran deal goes to the heart of the question about multilateralism. But of course the big issue this week that may really poison transatlantic relations is a possibility which Merkel referred to, namely that the US administration might impose tariffs on European cars. And this would be outrageous in the opinion of the Europeans, and that would really sour transatlantic relations. So Iran, I would say, is probably up at the top just now, but the trade issues are pretty near the top as well.
Director Yang Jiechi, Mr. Rong, from the Chinese side of the Central Commission for Foreign Affairs, talk about the vision that China has about the future world, which is about cooperation, dialogue, and not confrontation, and it's also about multilateralism, not unilateralism. But the question is China's description of these concepts coincides with the others' interpretation of these concepts? Or the words tend to be the same and the meaning could be different. Mr. Rong.
Yeah, that's right. I think let me just, before I answer your question,
go ahead,
yes, I would say a few words about the participation of Director Yang Jiechi. He's, I think, the top diplomat and representing the highest ranking of the representation to this security dialogue. It shows that the importance the Chinese government attached to this forum.
Right.
This is very much significant. And you're right, I think the Chinese side, the speech by Director Yang has made it very clear. I think the lot of concepts, lot of new thinkings that are being explained, and more importantly, I think also put forward some views how to approach it, how to implement these ideas. So the new type of international relations, the concept, the vision of community of shared future for mankind, and the new security concept. So this is, I think, a very good occasion and for China to provide some kind of alternative or China's vision on how to pursue multilateralism, how to manage and address the issues, the security issues for the region and the globe.
For those who have not been having the chance to listen to that speech, in a speech before the recent Munich Security Conference, Yang Jiechi, the Office Director of the Foreign Affairs Commission of the CPC Central Committee, pushed for a new vision of common security, which our guests all talk about, and a global response to the threat. Let's listen into what he exactly had to say.
We need to uphold universal security through mutual support. We should work towards a new vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security, and respect and protect the security of each and every country. Global issues such as climate change, cybersecurity, terrorism, and major natural disasters should be tackled through global responses, and regional and global security must be protected with common efforts.
That is Director Yang Jiechi at the Munich Security Conference. Now, Mr. Paul, you and Mr. Yang know each other for a long time as one of the very seasoned China experts from the United States. Of course, his speech tends to be more conceptual. It's about the logic that China sees in international relations. But, you know, at a time when the transatlantic relations are becoming quite thorny, the U.S.-China relations is not at its best page either. So the question is, whatever the concept is, what are some of the major issues that we really need to deal with one another in order to create confidence? Because that's what people complain the most, the lack of confidence and trust toward one another among countries these days.
Well, those are good questions, and the one you asked Mr. Rong a minute ago, you know, China says one thing about international cooperation, but people overseas hear something else. And I think that's a big problem right now. When you talk about a common destiny for mankind, multilateral solution to problems, common internet approach to cyber safety, people in the United States, under the consensus that has developed over the last decade or so, are very suspicious of China's motives. And they don't hear the same thing that I think Chinese hear when those words are uttered. We've got some big problems on this front. I just mentioned cybersecurity as one of them. When the U.S. First introduced the internet, it was meant to be an open international platform. But we've been seeing Russia and China and some other states, and Europe as a whole in its own way, trying to provide cybersecurity in ways that break down its international character and will make it more, to use an old word, balkanized, broken up into different systems with different rules and different national priorities. These are big differences in culture and in appreciation of each other. And the agenda of items where we can cooperate, to go to your question to me, is getting smaller and smaller. Obviously, the Trump administration is not interested in climate change cooperation, but the other areas that had the potential, cyberspace, international peace, fighting disease, the number of issues where we can cooperate is declining.
Professor Wang, want to invite you also into the discussion about that. I mean, the realities are the realities. We have to face up to the realities. The reality is what is happening today is not as rosy as it used to be, let's just say, 10 years ago. So, here's the thing. What can help us to pick up the spirit, at least with the limited consensus that we still have, toward a bigger portion of trust and also possibly cooperation, given the fact China-U.S. negotiation about trade, well, apparently it's about trade, is still going on. Is there a way of doing that?
I think as the report released before the Munich Security Conference, the world is flattening the pieces. I think the world needs more collaboration. Otherwise, anyone unilaterally cannot solve the problems. Given that there are so many emerging, rising, new, non-traditional security threats, like the cybersecurity, climate change, Director Yang also identified. So I think that's the Chinese approach. Even there are disputes between China and the United States about the cybersecurity, because China highlights sovereignty. It's not just a global commerce. Anyway, but the cyber terrorists, cyber attack, I think this we can do together first, and then have more self-confidence, and then can hand over the disputes.
Mr. Cameron, I also want you help us to understand that as well. You are not just a researcher coming from Europe. You've been working on global issues, including transatlantic and trans-Pacific relations. So, sir, help us to understand your vision here as well. When you have specific issues, whether it's a political system, it's the trade and economic ties, it's the cars, or it's the cybersecurity, or is it the Iran issue, are all entangled and do not have consensus one another. Is there a starting point? Or we are just gathering together at security conferences and complain to one another about what we don't like about each other, as if that could solve the problem. So what is the issue here? What is the starting point? Sir, it's a loaded question, but I am very passionate about this. I hope you are the same.
Yes, I mean, I've been involved in international relations for, 45 years or more. But there is no simple solution to many of these issues. We had a frozen conflict during the Cold War, then we had a period of unilateralism with the United States, the sort of hyperpuissance, as the French called it. And now we're moving into a different area where essentially the problems will be discussed by coalitions. There'll not be a single solution. I mean, we all would love to hear what Councillor Yang Jiechi said come true, but it's not going to come true. There is not going to be any global solutions to many of these issues. So what you're seeing now is different coalitions coming together to deal with Iran, to deal with climate change, to deal with trade. And here, it's essential that we bolster the WTO. That is really critical for the coming years. So the idea that there's going to be one single organization or one agreed view of the world, that is not going to happen. It's going to be very messy and very difficult. different coalitions coming together, but that is the reality of what we're facing. We have to accept that.
I see. Very messy. Mr. Rong, you have your eyebrows entangled together almost. I could tell you have also been puzzled about that for a long time. Mr. Rong, your thought?
Yeah, I agree. I fully agree with Dr. Cameron's view that we don't have an answer. But I would say there are easy answers. We all have, I mean, seems that there are no easy answers so far. But as far as I mean, the history, or if I mean the past decades of major country cooperation and coordination is concerned, we have some quite effective or successful experiences. I mean, we're talking about climate changes, and so that I should at least give some hope that if major countries, if I mean like the United States, continue to follow the approach being approved effective, then I think at least we can have hope. The problem now we are having is that the United States, instead of, I mean, continue to do that.
Yeah, but will that become just part of the reality?
That is why I think countries like China, Europe, EU, and others, and hopefully I think the voices, I mean, the different voices, alternative visions provided by the other, I mean, U.S. delegates would also help. I think the world help us to find an answer or find a solution.
Finally, before we go, I want to have the biggest takeaway. After all, the Munich Security Conference only takes place once every year, and this time the biggest Chinese delegation and a lot of German efforts being put into that, and certainly a big American delegation as well. I just want to have a final word from you. What should be the real takeaway, despite the fight, the real takeaway from this year's conference? Professor Wang, one sentence, please.
I think the international community should work together to prepare for the post-Trump eras, multilateral corporations ever.
Wow, you're thinking ahead. Mr. Paul.
Well, my thoughts are much the same. I think it's an encouraging sign that the Europeans are pulling together in response to the new directions taken by the Trump administration.
Okay.
But they still have a long way to go to become a coalition of consequence.
Well, Mr. Cameron, final words?
The biggest issue wasn't even discussed at Munich, and that's the growing tension between India and Pakistan. The Kashmir conflict is unresolved, and that is probably the biggest danger to world security today.
We have a lot of dangers these days going on, popping up as a result of lack of order, general order and confidence. And last but not least, Mr. Rong.
I've been hopeful, and I continue to be hopeful. I think as long as countries like China and other emerging countries continue to advocate and promote multilateralism, this hope remains hopeful.
Let's be hopeful. All right then, I guess with that hope note, we are wrapping up this discussion, at least for now. From my part, thank you so much, the full of you gentlemen, for sharing with us your insights with decades of research. Really appreciate it. Douglas Paul, Fraser Cameron, Rong Ying, last but not least, Wang Yiwei. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. And stay with us here on World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. Cooperation on technology and education between China and the U.S. Yes, some people is talking about that. Our interview with the president of the Yale University, a renowned Ivy League school in the U.S. That interview right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Uncertainty grows in a fast-changing world. The clock ticks for negotiations between China and the United States, with the deadline coming in 2 weeks, apparently. No matter the outcome, tense relations could have a ripple effect in other areas, such as technology and education. China-U.S. cooperation in higher education has flourished in recent decades. Thousands of students are pursuing academic degrees in each other's universities. For example, Yale University, an Ivy League school in the U.S., has a long history of connection with China since the 19th century. It has more than hundreds of Chinese students studying various subjects, accounting for the largest number of international students in the university. Earlier, I talked to Peter Salovey, the president of Yale University, about how to work on educational cooperation in a changing world. course, this is a dramatic changing time we're facing right now, that nobody really knows the solutions, or at least the solutions to all the problems and the challenges, and therefore we're struggling, and we do not see others to really be a real help.
I think that's part of the reason why this generation, younger generation today, feels quite a bit of anxiety.
Yeah.
We hear a lot about stress and anxiety from our students. And
we felt also a lot of anxiety when we were really young, right?
Yeah, but there's a lot of differences. I think you know, I'm quite a bit older than you, but we probably, both of our generations, learned a lot more to be resilient, to solve problems on our own, to seek others to help us solve those problems. I'm not here to blame parents, but child rearing has changed. Parents, because they're worried about safety and security of their children, are much more inclined to solve problems for their kids. So the kids don't learn the experience of failure, of picking yourself up after falling down, of solving problems on your own. And so they are more easily stressed. So you're asking about solutions. I think one of the things we have to do is, you know, I'm glad that our students are more likely to seek professional help. That's good. That means the stigma of mental health is lower. But that can't be the only solution. You know, you can't keep building capacity in your counseling and psychological services clinic and demand just keeps going up, right? You have to do something else.
That's right.
And I think we have to do more outreach and education and prevention. You know, what can we do with students to help them learn the skills of resilience, to help them learn how to relax, to help them, and there's lots of ways. They can learn mindfulness meditation, they can learn problem-solving techniques, they can learn relaxation techniques, lots of things they can learn.
As the president of one of the most renowned universities in the world, how do you see these changing of times? Politics, uncertainty in the economy, surprisingly exciting, but at the same time nervous technological development. How is that having an impact on your way of leading the students?
Sure. It's, there is no doubt we live in challenging times. We live in times that are filled with anxiety. You can see that all over the world. I believe as a university leader, my job is to encourage partnership, to encourage multilateral thinking, to recognize, for example, that our two nations, when we work together, are much more likely to help solve the problems of the world than when we're not working. Philosophically, I think universities are great conveners. They're great places where people can share ideas and learn to work together across the boundaries of background, of ethnicity, of nationality, of culture. And that's how some of the greatest things have happened.
Can we still do
I
that?
think we can. I think we will occasionally...
What is feeding your confidence?
I guess I have seen periods in time when, whether it's U.S.-China or any other relationship, are strained. And then over time we work through them and we come out the other side and we work together cooperatively and collaboratively. It's in the long run, it's the only way forward.
So we have to put things really into a perspective, right? Into a stretch
a little bit of a longer time horizon.
Can we do that? Because these days, we're all on daily crisis management.
Well, that's a problem.
Exactly.
We're, you know, and you know, you asked about philosophy of educational leaders. This is really a challenge for us. The day-to-day crises drive out room for often thinking about what's truly important.
That's true.
And you know, what's important to me are creating partnerships, educating future leaders from all over the world. That's what I want to be doing every day.
The other thing about education is how can we combine different elements of thinking into the same process? For example, philosophical thinking, historical thinking, but at the same time pragmatic thinking.
One of the things we have to do in universities is break down the barriers between disciplines and ideas. Disciplines are important. They give you a structured way of asking a question and seeking an answer. Students need to learn disciplined thinking, but they also need to learn how to transcend those boundaries and think across boundaries, whatever those boundaries are. I once gave a welcoming speech to our new students and asked them, why do you think it's so important to have students from different cultures in the same classroom? And you know, the answer to that is our different life experiences, our different histories give us different perspectives. And when we're all working together to solve a problem, but bringing those different perspectives to the problem, I think we're more likely to find a solution.
More and more these days, I feel such a deficit of the knowledge of the past, particularly of history, and the possibility of being able to do cultural comparison, historical comparison. But how could you be able to say, I have enough knowledge, and therefore I can be confident about what I'm thinking right now?
Well,
I share that with the rest of the world, you know?
I think you never have enough knowledge. You still have to share your thoughts, however.
Exactly.
And I think what universities need to do is make people curious for the rest of their lives, so that you're always learning, you're always taking in new information, you're always being critical.
Right. You talk about U.S.-China, so let me come back to that topic. Is the strategic relationship between these two getting more strained than it has been, let's just say, over the past 40 years? How would it possible for the two countries and the two academic circles, you representing a very important part of it, be able to work together? That's a big question mark, in fact. And if we cannot, that would be such a loss.
I think
and
so
a shame,
too.
actually.
No, I think so too. The more we can do to understand each other's culture and history, the more we'll be able to work together in the present. You know, the challenge is the present is very compelling. Yale has done programs. We looked at the preservation of cultural heritage and why that's important, the role of the humanities in a technologically changing world. We try to bring that perspective. You know, the first student from China who ever was educated in North America was educated at Yale.
Yes.
And I believe it was about 1850. His name was Rong Hung.
Right.
And when you think about that, that was, what, 150 years ago, 170 years ago. And that's a long time. That's a big time frame. And that's just and that's even just recent history itself.
Globalization, as we all know, Professor, has been putting all of us together, particularly the flow of talents. But of course, you know, things happen. For example, geopolitics, that could temporarily cut off to a certain extent. But the question is, before that happens, how can we prevent it?
I think universities play an important role in preventing isolation, you know, geopolitical isolation.
Politicians just want to make the policy they want to.
Well,
what can you do?
They can, but you know, even in the depths of the Cold War, Russian and U.S. scientists were working together. It was still happening on certain topics. Even in periods where China-U.S. relations weren't perfect, academics found ways to work together. Students went on exchange. Now it's true, you know, through visa policies and others, this can be restricted. But I would hope that we recognize that you know, China's best friends are Americans who have studied in China, and Americans' best friends in China are Chinese students who have studied in America.
Right.
And it is in our mutual national interests to encourage the flow of students and scholars between countries.
The human mind is a terrible thing to waste. The Yale University president knows it better than most, being an early pioneer in emotional intelligence. He did say in the age of high technology, it could get in the way of mental health and human relations, but it also has the power to break down barriers in thinking between the East and the West. Professor, you have been researching about neuroscience. So one of the important issues people talk about with neuroscience, our mind, is what about artificial intelligence? Right? When is artificial intelligence going to be able to replace us to do the so-called common sense things? But to you, how far is it? Is it scary, so-called artificial intelligence? Or we are just in another stage of discovering the real talent of our minds?
Yeah, I think the kinds of advances we're making in artificial intelligence, machine learning, use of big data to feed,
and the list goes on,
is amazing. But I personally believe that there's always going to be human involvement. There's always going to be accountability to a human. So even if an artificial intelligence is designing an investment portfolio, or even if it's teaching you something in ed tech, or you're going to want the opportunity to discuss it with a human. You're going to want to check it out with a human. We notice this even with driverless cars. People still want a driver in there, just in case, just as we want a pilot, a live pilot in the pilot seat of an airplane, even though the airplane can land itself. I think there's always going to be human involvement. The roles will change, the jobs will change. We need to offer a very flexible education, a liberal education that helps students learn how to communicate and think critically and work together in teams, because those jobs will always change. But we don't know. We think we know what they are for the next 5 years. We don't know what they are 25 years from now.
That's the politics of artificial intelligence. But the thing is, as a scientist yourself, I mean, how much potential is really still there in our mind?
Yeah, I think artificial intelligence and neuroscience, neuroimaging, I think they're going to be mutually insightful. We're going to learn more about how to create artificial intelligence by studying the mind, and we're going to learn more about the mind by simulating it through artificial intelligence. I think this is going to be a period of some great breakthroughs. And that...
When is that going to be? What is likely to be the type of breakthrough? I mean, you must have a certain sense of it
I think it's happening now. We can look at things
what might be the direction of really the real breakthrough?
So I think one direction of research that we're seeing already is the ability through neuroimaging to actually know what people are thinking.
Yes.
That's
scary, isn't it?
It's scary, and if used unethically, it's not good. But that may actually help us develop insights into the causes of dementia, into treatments that are being more effective for dementia, and evaluating treatments. If we can really read the mind in that way, right? All of that is very promising.
One of the biggest challenges we're facing these days is mental health.
So
I know you are here together with your colleagues to discuss the issues about that, but where is the solution?
So that's a very good question. There probably isn't just one solution. And they're really looking at how many of our insights about what makes us happy are actually wrong. So one that we've known about for a long time is wealth. So getting people out of poverty and into the middle class, that does make them happier. But fabulous wealth beyond that actually doesn't make them happier. Here's another example. People think that if they just had more time for themselves, they could have some solitude, they'd be happier. But actually, it's interacting with other people that makes them happier.
People have been searching for the source of happiness from the very beginning of our life, right? So at the end of the day, now we're in a apparently different stage. What tools do we have? What more tools do we have?
Well, I'll tell you one tool that we need to use a little less of.
Okay.
So unfortunately, Confucius or Aristotle didn't anticipate this.
All right.
But one of the things that is making us anxious, that is making us depressed, is when we cut off our relationships with others because we're totally absorbed in our technology. And you see that, I see that on campus. In the dining hall, students sitting with headphones or texting or watching something or reading something on their cell phones. That's okay some of the time. But when it starts to replace normal human relationships, it actually gets in the way of our happiness. I think we have to be very careful. Technology is great. I'm so glad I have a cell phone. Right? My life has changed. But if it ends up distancing me from other people, from social relationships, the big source of our happiness is missing.
So we are paying the price for convenience.
Yeah.
Actually, the fun of life.
Yeah, I think people just didn't realize that the technology would be so addictive, and that it would that we would use it almost to the exclusion of other kinds of interaction. And you know, it matters a good bit whether you're born digital or you're old like me. You know, for me, it's less an intrusive part of my life. For me, it's a tool. I take it out when I need it. I put it away when I don't need it. I try to turn it off at night. Right. But for my students, they don't remember a life without a mobile phone. And so they are constantly attached to it.
Professor, there has been so much discussion these days, and one of the things is people have very different ways of looking at things. I mean, this sounds like a cliche, but it's not. For example, the Asians or the Chinese, for example, tend to look at history, tend to look at the relationship among different factors. But simply put, for example, people here in the West tend to think about, what about that? Give me the answer to exactly that question. How do you, as a neuroscientist and as an educator, see this difference? And how they can be mobilized for the best use?
Yeah, well, so certainly those differences are real. A psychologist named Richard Nisbett, for example, at the University of Michigan, studied how people, for example, from China are more likely to think about context, more likely to think about the environment that surrounds something. Westerners, like North Americans, are more likely to be focal. What, you know, so the classic experiment, looking at a tank of fish, and you ask people what do they see. Somebody from China is more likely to say, I see the scene of what's under the sea. I see sand and water and fish.
I wish I could be that imaginable.
Right? American is more likely to say, I see 3 fish, 2 guppies and 1 zebrafish. You know, they more the focal.
Yeah, of course, that's a generalized way of looking.
Right, and of course, there's lots of variability. It's not, you know, you don't want to caricature.
That's an interesting phenomenon.
So it's a different phenomenon. So what it means is when we're solving problems, if we work together and have both of those perspectives in the room, we're going to come up with different solutions than if we're working in isolation. And that's why I'm so oriented around cooperation. Now, finding the neuroscience basis for those cultural differences, that awaits. As best as I know, that has not been discovered yet, but that's coming.
Well, Professor, I'm sure with our conversation we can see you have a lot of work to do.
Thank you. Well,
from the neuroscience perspective.
We do, we do.
What a pleasure seeing you.
It's always wonderful to see you, and thank you for giving us the time, and it's good to see you again.
Thank you so much for your insights.
Great.
Peter Salovey, president of the Yale University in the U.S. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From Yi Tianwei and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.